All right, welcome to our first lecture for today. Be sure to watch this one and the following one on Charlemagne's Empire. Both of them will be covered on today's quiz. But we're going to spend a few minutes here talking about Germanic law and education. And this lecture is going to be fairly broad in that we're not looking at a sort of a distinct timeline or a distinct sort of uh, place or period, but we'll be talking very broadly about Germanic tribes, and we'll sort of end up in the 8th and 9th century. But for the most part, this will be a very sort of broad lecture. So just as a reminder, we are once again moving westward. So we are leaving the east behind, and we're going into these western kingdoms that were established by the Germanic tribes after the fall of the Roman Empire. So this is a sort of generalized map of the different western kingdoms. We're going to spend a lot of time today with the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons in particular. But again, this is just generally the areas that we will be speaking about sort of broadly. All right, so early Germanic law was not written down. So if you'll remember, the Germanic tribes did not have a form of writing, so they did not record any of their laws prior to contact with the Roman Empire. But nevertheless, they did have a very distinct set of laws and social norms. This is recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus in his book Germania. But their laws consisted primarily of customs that were sort of universally recognized among the tribes and were passed down generation to generation. And it's important to note that they saw the law as this sort of transcendent thing that was above kings as well as the sort of everyday person. So the law was above everything, which is not necessarily how the Romans or the Greeks viewed it at different points in time. So the Germanic tribes were sort of distinct in that belief. So they had various methods of issuing the law, methods of arbitration. So kings or a king of a tribe could arbitrate, but this was less common than some of their other means of settling disputes. Um, so most often their laws were administered by assemblies. So similar to the way that we have, jurors or a jury of peers. If somebody was put on trial for something, then they were most often being judged by their peers um, rather than a king or some sort of higher power. Two common methods that they used for arbitration were called compurgation and ordeals. So compurgation is similar to what we would call a character witness today. So if someone is put on trial today, they may call upon people who know this person in various different settings, whether that's personally or at work or in school or something. They'll call upon them to testify as to what this person is like, what is their character. And so a congregation would be composed of 12 men who would testify to an individual's character or value, and that's particularly value to their community. So what would the community lose if this person were gone? And an ordeal is a little more interesting, perhaps, and this is a supernatural process in which the gods determined an individual's fate. So oftentimes your book mentions, putting your hand in a pot of boiling water or grasping a hot iron. And if you were able to remove your hand uninjured, then you were innocent. Other times it comes down to duels. So two people might duel to decide who is in the right. essentially a fight to the death. Whoever dies died because they were in the wrong, and the gods revealed that um, the winner was in the right in whatever the situation may be. So confrontation and ordeals were two common ways to settle disputes in the Germanic tribes, and these sort of things are seen in the older Germanic tribes as well as in the Western kingdoms that are established. So it's not until the Western kingdoms come around that these laws are sort of codified or compiled um, in writing. So we have lots of legal codes from the 5th century, most notably from the Franks, the Lombards, the Visigoths, and the Anglo-Saxons. Um, and they tell us a lot about what was going on during these time periods. We've talked before about how Germanic culture was sort of mingling with Roman culture, and and that is really revealed in some of the laws that they choose to write down. Um, an important thing to note here that will sort of change over time is that at this time, around the 5th century, the kings are responsible for a lot of the written legal codes that we have today, but they weren't making laws. They were just recording the laws that had already been established by the people. So again, the Germanic tribes did not have any written laws, but they did have a distinct set of laws that had been recognized for centuries. And so, when the Western kings decide to write them down, they are not making new laws. They are only observing and recording the laws that already exist. Um, and so, sort of the dissemination of the law or the dealing out of the law was largely not dealt with by kings. It was still left to the people to decide how disputes should be settled. Um, but so they were often sort of contained within their own smaller communities rather than sort of the large scale um, politics and government that we saw in Rome and Greece. It was much more informal than any sort of democracy or republic that we've studied. A constant issue with the Germanic tribes that we will see for a while are feuds or feuding between families, or sometimes even within families. And so this is an issue before the Germanic tribes come into contact with Rome, and it is an issue even after the Western kingdoms are established. So to try to mitigate the feuds, some customary laws attempted to limit the occasions in which feuding could occur. So there were specific situations in which they would say, okay, yeah, you can fight this out, you can go to war or to battle against one another, but most often they wanted to find other ways of settling things. And one of the primary ways that they attempted to mitigate feuds was with this idea of Wergeld or mangold. Um, Again, that's one of those sort of kennings that we talked about in Beowulf, those combined words, Wergeld. Um, and so a Wergeld is essentially sort of the price that is put upon one's life or one's body. So if one person killed another person, then they would have to pay a Wergeld to that person's family to pay for their death, for that loss of life. Um, but they also had a lot of very specific fines that were dealt out for different types of offenses or injuries. So if you cut off somebody's ear or nose, or you cut their beard, you might have to pay a Wergeld that was smaller than if you had killed them, but it was meant to sort of prevent those types of interactions and pacify the victims. But also sort of led to interesting things that if you really wanted to cut off somebody's ear and you knew that you could afford it, then you might as well go ahead and do it. All right. So as we said earlier, Early on, the kings were not making laws, they were just writing them down, recording them. But as time passes and as they become increasingly involved in the writing down and enforcing of laws, they begin to write laws of their own. And so we'll see as time goes on that laws and legal codes become a source of political power for kings. Um, and this is something that we'll see just increasingly as these kingdoms develop, even into next semester, when we'll still be dealing with some of these different areas of power. So some important things to know that have come out of these codes are trial by assembly, which we've already spoken about. This is very influential to Western society. It's still something that we use today. That it's not just the government or some higher power that is going to lay down judgment. It's going to be the people themselves that determine how to settle disputes. And also the rule of law, or this idea that no one is above the law. Even kings have to submit to it, is another important thing that comes from these Germanic tribes and their legal codes. All right, so now we're going to move briefly into England. So England at this time was divided up into multiple different kingdoms that you can see here. And some of them, the names still linger today, like Wessex or Sussex or Essex and Kent, are still names of places today. So at this time, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were still integrating Christianity, and as it becomes more and more prominent in England, the church begins to form similarly to that of the Roman Church, with a hierarchy of church officials. So there are some monastic missions still, but we're seeing the emergence of bishops and priests that will oversee different areas of England and report to the church. But the establishment of the church leads to an influx of scholars and educational establishments in England. So oftentimes monasteries and the monks and nuns living there were accomplished scholars that spent a lot of their time devoted to study and academics. One such monk was Saint Bede. He was an 8th century scholar and Benedictine monk from England, and he is responsible for preserving and explaining many older works of scholarship. So he translated them, he interpreted them, and he synthesized them into works like The Nature of Things and An Ecclesiastical History of the English People. And he is also responsible for adopting the dating system of Dionysius Exiguus, which starts the counting of years with the birth of Christ. So Exiguus came up with the system and St. Bede implemented it. And Anglo-Saxon law has a few sort of things that we want to note here. There's common law, which is like that of most of the Germanic tribes, the laws that we've already talked about, the ones that are sort of just recognized customs. But they also introduce statutory law, and these are laws that are created and approved by a legislative body. And important to note that kings kept a council called the Witan or Wittenagemot, and kings were beginning to divide their kingdom into shires and assigned different royal offices to govern them remotely. One such king is Alfred the Great. He's the king of Wessex in southern England. He is notable for his military victories, his wisdom, and his contributions to art and learning. By the start of his reign, the Danes had already invaded England and were causing disruption there. So Alfred signed a treaty with them, with the Danish king Guthrum in 886, and split the English island into two. Part of this treaty was that the Danes would agree to convert to Christianity in order to be permitted to rule in the north.